"I'll give you home," a rich rancher told a shivering mother of twins. "What he did the next day will leave you breathless." On a night when the blizzard howled and death was close, a powerful man stumbled on a mother and her little ones, freezing in a broken shack. He promised them warmth, shelter, a future. But on the frontier, promises come with a price. The ranch filled with laughter again, and for the first time in years, hope flickered in the firelight. Yet whispers spread through town, accusations of theft, debts unpaid, and a rival rancher hungry for power. Soon, heavy boots thudded on the porch, jail keys rattled. Children's cries echoed as the law tore them from the hearth. Behind every smile, a secret burns. Behind every neighbor's nod, a hidden hand waits to strike. What truth could shatter lies strong enough to steal children from their mother? And when the snow settles, will that rancher's promise of home stand or be crushed forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter wind howled across the Colorado highlands, driving sheets of snow that stung like needles against any exposed skin. Lucas McCord hunched lower in his saddle, drawing his heavy wool coat tighter around his broad shoulders. His trusted stallion pressed forward against the gale as they made their evening rounds, checking fence lines that were barely visible in the growing darkness. The lantern swaying from his saddle cast wild shadows through the swirling snow. Lucas knew these highlands like the back of his hand, but tonight the familiar landscape had transformed into something alien and treacherous. His thoughts drifted to his empty ranch house, where a warm fire waited. But duty came first. Loose cattle in this weather meant dead cattle by morning. A sound caught his attention, so faint he nearly missed it beneath the moaning wind. Lucas pulled his horse to a halt, turning his head to listen. There it came. Again, a cry that made his chest tighten. It sounded like a child. "Whoa, boy," he murmured, guiding his mount toward the sound. Through the thickening snow, a dark shape gradually emerged, the old line shack that hadn't seen use in years. As he drew closer, his stomach knotted at the sight of its partially collapsed roof. Now laden with heavy snow. Lucas dismounted, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. The cry came again, clearer now, accompanied by hushing sounds. A mother's voice. He approached the weathered door, raising his lantern. "Hello," he called out, his deep voice carrying over the wind. "Anyone in there?" Silence answered him. Then a woman's voice, trembling but firm. "Go away. We don't need help." Lucas frowned, noting how the voice quavered with cold. "Ma'am, there's a blizzard bearing down. This shack ain't safe." He pushed the door open slowly, lantern light spilling into the cramped interior. The sight before him made his heart clench. A woman sat huddled in the corner, clutching two small children wrapped in threadbare quilts. Their faces were pale, lips tinged with blue. The woman, young with dark hair and fierce eyes, stared at him like a cornered animal. "I'm Lucas McCord," he said softly, the way he might approach a spooked horse. "I own the Triple M Ranch about 3 miles east. You can't stay here tonight." "We're fine," the woman insisted, though her teeth chattered. "I'm Lisa Harper, and we don't take charity." One of the children whimpered, burrowing deeper into the thin quilt. Lucas saw how Lisa's arms tightened around them, protective as a mother bear, but pride wouldn't keep them warm tonight. "This ain't charity, Mrs. Harper. This is survival." He gestured to the groaning roof. "That snow gets any heavier, this whole place could come down." Liza glanced up fearfully at the sagging beams, then back at Lucas. "I don't know you, Mr. McCord, and men," she swallowed hard. "Men ain't always what they seem." Understanding dawned in Lucas's eyes. Someone had hurt this woman, or at least given her cause to fear. The knowledge stirred something in him, memories of his own loss, the empty rooms of his house that once rang with his son's laughter and his wife's sweet voice. "I give you my word before God," he said solemnly. No harm will come to you, your children under my roof. He knelt down, meeting her gaze directly. But I can't leave you here to freeze. I wouldn't be able to live with myself. As if to emphasize his point, a violent gust rattled the shack's walls. Both children began to cry in earnest now, their small bodies shaking uncontrollably. Lucas saw the moment Lisa's resolve cracked, mother's love winning out over pride and fear. "They're so cold," she whispered, voice breaking. Lucas didn't wait for further permission. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around all three of them, then gathered the twins into his arms. They felt light as birds, and just as fragile. "My horse is strong enough to carry us all," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll ride close together for warmth." Liza stood shakily, clutching his coat around her shoulders. "Why?" she asked, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Why help strangers?" Lucas paused at the door, the precious burden of her children secure in his embrace. The answer rose from somewhere deep in his soul, where grief had lived so long it had almost become comfort. "I'll give you home," he declared firmly, the words carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "That's what neighbors do out here. We look after our own." The wind howled outside, but in that moment, something shifted between them. Trust, fragile as a newly kindled flame, but burning steady enough to light the way through the storm. Lucas cradled Sarah and Eli close to his chest as he approached his horse. The faithful stallion stood steady against the howling wind, steam rising from his flanks. With careful movements, Lucas arranged the twins on the saddle, positioning them so they wouldn't slip. "Sarah, Eli, I need you to hold tight to the saddle." "Horn," he instructed, making sure their small hands gripped the leather. The children nodded, their faces pale but trusting. Liza hovered nearby, still wrapped in Lucas's coat. Her eyes never left her children, watching every move Lucas made with the wariness of a mother hawk. When he stepped back to check his work, she reached up to touch each child's cheek. "Are you certain they won't fall?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Yes, ma'am, I'll lead Thunder myself, nice and slow." Lucas gathered the reins in his gloved hand. "We'll all walk together." The snow had deepened considerably, creating drifts that reached past their knees in places. Lucas broke trail, leading his horse through the worst of it. The wind cut through their clothes like icy knives, and the lantern light created eerie shadows in the swirling snow. "Sarah?" "Eli," Lucas called over his shoulder, checking on his small passengers. "You doing all right up there?" "Cold," Sarah answered, her voice quavering but brave. "But Eli and me are holding on tight, Mr. McCord." "That's good, Sarah. You're being real brave." Lucas glanced at Liza, who trudged alongside him. "Both your children are strong, Mrs. Harper." Liza pulled the coat closer around her shoulders. "They have to be," she replied softly, then fell silent. Again, the journey seemed to stretch endlessly through the darkness. Lucas kept them moving steadily forward, one step at a time. Thunder struggled against the deepening snow, but the horse's training showed in his patient persistence. Every few minutes, Lucas would speak words of encouragement to the children or point out landmarks only he could recognize in the storm. "See that big rock there?" he said, gesturing with the lantern. "That means we're getting close. My ranch house sits just beyond that rise." Ela, who had barely spoken a word, suddenly pointed ahead. "Light!" he exclaimed through the curtain of snow. A warm glow beckoned. The windows of Lucas's ranch house shone like beacons, and smoke rose from the chimney despite the storm. Lucas felt his shoulders relax slightly at the sight of home. "Mrs. Harlow must have kept the lamps burning," he said, more to himself than his companions. "She always knows." As they approached the house, the front door flew open. Mrs. Harlow stood in the doorway, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath a cap, her practical dress covered by a worn apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of the bedraggled group. "Land sakes! Lucas McCord," she exclaimed, already rolling up her sleeves. "Bring them in quickly now. I've got soup warming and blankets ready." Lucas helped the children down from the saddle, then turned to Lisa. "Mrs. Harlow's been my housekeeper for 15 years. You can trust her." Inside, warmth from the blazing fireplace enveloped them. Mrs. Harlow took charge immediately, her efficiency born of years of handling emergencies on the frontier. She wrapped the twins in thick wool blankets and settled them near the hearth, while Lucas saw to his horse. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, Mrs. Harlow was already ladling hot broth into tin cups. The children sat close together, their small hands wrapped around the warm cups, color slowly returning to their cheeks. Liza perched on the edge of a chair nearby, still wearing Lucas's coat, watching everything with guarded eyes. Lucas stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind's howl seemed distant now, locked outside where it belonged. His house, so often empty and quiet, felt different with these souls filling it. Removing his hat, Lucas bowed his head slightly. His lips moved in a silent prayer of thanks, for finding them in time, for the strength to bring them home, for the chance to help. When he looked up, he caught Mrs. Harlow, watching him with knowing eyes. She gave him a small nod before turning back to tend to their guests. Sarah's voice broke the quiet. "Thank you for the soup, ma'am. It's real good." "You're welcome, child," Mrs. Harlow replied warmly. "Drink it all up now. Nothing better for chasing away the cold." Lucas moved to add another log to the fire, careful not to disturb the children. The flames leaped higher, and in their light, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Eli had fallen asleep, his head resting against his sister's shoulder, the empty cup still clutched in his small hands. The sight stirred something in his chest, an ache he thought he'd buried years ago. Mrs. Harlow ladled steaming venison stew into earthenware bowls, the rich aroma filling the warm kitchen. The twins, Sarah and Eli, had already finished their broth and sat close together on a bench near the fire, their eyes following the housekeeper's movements with quiet interest. "There's plenty more if you're still hungry," Lucas said, setting a bowl in front of Liza. She stiffened slightly at his approach but managed a small nod. "Thank you," she murmured, her spoon moving slowly through the thick stew. Her gaze never strayed far from her children, watching them with the vigilance of a mother who had learned to expect the worst. Mrs. Harlow hummed softly as she worked, an old hymn that seemed to soften the edges of the awkward silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside, the wind continued its mournful song against the window panes. "The storm's settling in for the night," Lucas observed, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "You'll all stay here until it passes. It ain't safe to travel in weather like this." Liza's spine straightened. "We wouldn't want to impose. It's no imposition," Mrs. Harlow cut in firmly, her tone brooking no argument. "Those children need proper rest in proper beds. I've already laid out fresh quilts in the spare room." As if to emphasize her point, Sarah yawned widely, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. Eli followed suit, leaning heavily against his sister's shoulder. "Mama, I'm sleepy," he announced, his voice small but clear. Something flickered across Liza's face, relief mingled with lingering uncertainty. She pushed her half-finished stew away and stood. "Then we should get you both to bed." "This way," Mrs. Harlow gestured, leading them toward the stairs. "I've put out clean nightshirts too. They might be a bit large, but they'll do for sleeping." Lucas remained at the table, listening to the sounds of life filling his house. Children's feet on the wooden stairs, their quiet giggles as Mrs. Harlow helped them prepare for bed, Liza's soft voice giving instructions about washing faces and saying prayers. Each sound stirred memories he'd thought safely buried, Catherine's laugh echoing through these same rooms, little James's bedtime. Stories, the gentle rhythm of family life he'd once known. The fire needed banking for the night. Lucas moved to tend it, adding another log and adjusting the screen. Behind him, he heard footsteps on the stairs, Liza's he knew from their likeness. "Mr. McCord," she said, her voice low but clear. He turned to face her. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, one hand resting on the banister, uncertainty written in every line of her body. I want to thank you. For finding us, for bringing us here. I don't know what would have happened if—" She stopped, swallowing hard. Lucas nodded, understanding all she couldn't say. "A roof's no use without someone beneath it," he replied simply, meaning every word. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decode some hidden meaning in his words. Finding none, she nodded back. "Good night, then." "Good night, Mrs. Harper." After she disappeared upstairs, Lucas sat in his chair by the fire, listening to the settling sounds of his house. Mrs. Harlow's footsteps moved between rooms, checking on their guests one last time before retiring to her own quarters off the kitchen. The wind's fury seemed to lessen, its howl softening to a whisper. Peace descended gradually, like snow drifting down to cover rough ground. Lucas felt it in the warmth of the fire, in the distant murmur of children's voices saying their prayers, in the creaking of familiar floorboards under new feet. For the first time in years, the silence in his house didn't feel like an accusation. Instead, it felt like a pause between breaths, a moment of waiting for something new to begin. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time in this strange new reality. Lucas closed his eyes, offering up a silent prayer of thanks. Not just for finding them in time, but for the way their presence had already begun to thaw something frozen within these walls. Whether they stayed a day or a week, something had shifted, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. Outside, the storm continued its dance across the Colorado highlands, but inside Lucas McCord's ranch house, 4 souls rested secure beneath his roof. And the night deepened into something approaching peace. The pale winter sun crept over the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. The storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a pristine white blanket that sparkled in the early morning light. Lucas stood on his front porch, coffee cup steaming in his hand, watching the last wisps of clouds scatter across the brightening sky. Inside, he could hear the clatter of breakfast dishes and Mrs. Harlow's voice directing the morning's activities. The sound of children's laughter, so long absent from his home, drifted through the walls, stirring something deep in his chest. "Might be a good morning to show the little ones the barn," Mrs. Harlow suggested when he stepped back inside. She gave him a meaningful look over her shoulder as she stacked plates. Children need fresh air, even in winter. Eli and Sarah sat at the table, finishing the last bites of their breakfast. They looked different in the daylight, cleaner, more alive, though their clothes still spoke of hard times. "Would you two like to meet the horses?" Lucas asked, his voice gentler than usual. Sarah's eyes lit up immediately. "Real horses, up close?" Eli looked less certain, but curiosity won out over timidity. He glanced at his mother for permission. Liza hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Stay close to Mr. McCord," she instructed, her hands busy helping Mrs. Harlow clear the table. Lucas led the children across the yard, breaking a path through the knee-deep snow. The barn doors creaked open to reveal the warm, hay-scented interior. Horses nickered in greeting, their breath visible in the cool air. "These here are working horses," Lucas explained, leading them to the first stall. "This one's Thunder. He helped bring you all home last night." Sarah reached out fearlessly to stroke Thunder's velvet nose. Eli hung back until the horse stretched, its neck toward him, snuffling curiously at his coat. A small smile broke across his face as he reached up to touch the white star on Thunder's forehead. "They're so warm," he whispered, wonder replacing fear in his voice. The chickens scratching in the hay drew their attention next. Sarah giggled as they pecked around her feet, while Eli carefully collected 2 brown eggs from the nesting boxes. Under Lucas's guidance, back in the house, Liza stood at the kitchen table beside Mrs. Harlow, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded bread dough with steady, rhythmic movements. The physical work seemed to ease something in her shoulders, in the tight set of her mouth. "You've done this before," Mrs. Harlow observed, adding more flour to the board. "My mother taught me," Liza replied softly. Before everything changed." Lucas paused in the doorway, watching. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching in Liza's dark hair, highlighting the determination in her face as she worked the dough. She looked more substantial somehow, more present than the desperate woman he'd found in the line shack. After the bread was set to rise, Lucas hitched Thunder to the wagon. "Thought you might like to see the boundaries of the ranch," he offered. "It's a fair piece of land." They settled into the wagon, the children tucked between blankets, Liza perched carefully on the seat beside him. The runners cut smoothly through the fresh snow as Lucas guided them across his property. "Creek runs year-round there," he pointed out. "Good water, even in drought. Grazing land stretches clear to those hills. Lost some cattle in last year's hard winter, but we're building the herd back up." Liza took it all in silently, her eyes scanning the vast expanse of white-covered fields and distant tree lines. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you showing us all this?" Lucas kept his eyes on the path ahead. "Reckon everyone should know where they're standing." "We can't stay," she said, though the words seemed to cost her. "We have nothing to offer in return." "That ain't what I'm asking." A long pause followed, broken only by the crunch of snow under the runners and the children's quiet chatter in the wagon bed. "My husband," Liza began, then stopped. Started again. "Thomas, he left debts. In town, they say he stole money before he disappeared. The shame of it." She twisted her hands in her lap. "We had nowhere else to go. The line shack was abandoned, and I thought we could survive there until spring." Lucas listened, keeping his expression neutral even as anger burned in his chest, not at her, but at the man who'd abandoned his family to such desperate straits. "Debts don't matter here," he said finally. "What matters is keeping those children warm and fed." He turned to meet her eyes directly. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The wagon continued its slow circuit of the ranch, but something had shifted between them, a first crack in the wall of Liza's wariness, a tentative step toward trust. The morning dawned crisp and clear, frost glittering on fence posts as Lucas hitched his wagon for the supply run to town. Mrs. Harlow handed him a carefully written list, her neat script detailing needed items from the mercantile. "We'll need more flour," she said, tucking an extra note into his coat pocket. "And that children could use warmer stockings." Lucas nodded, glancing toward the house where Liza sat by the window, teaching the twins their letters using an old Bible. The sight warmed something in his chest, even as he worried about leaving them alone. "I'll keep watch," Mrs. Harlow assured him, reading his concern. "Go on now." The 10-mile drive to town passed quickly, his thoughts circling back to the family taking shelter under his roof. At the mercantile, Lucas tied his horse and stepped into the warmth of the store. The bell above the door chimed, drawing curious looks from the handful of customers inside. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, greeted him with unusual reserve. "Morning, McCord. Heard you've got company up at your place." "News travels fast," Lucas replied evenly, handing over Mrs. Harlow's list, while Peterson gathered supplies. Whispered conversations drifted between the shelves. Lucas caught fragments, widow woman, and those poor children, but kept his expression neutral as he selected warm stockings for the twins. The bell chimed again. Clayton Briggs stepped inside, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden floor. The wealthy rancher's presence seemed to fill the store, his smile sharp as a knife's edge. "Well, if it ain't the Good Samaritan himself," Briggs drawled, positioning himself between Lucas and the door. "Taking in strays now, McCord." Lucas continued examining a bolt of wool cloth. Helping neighbors in need ain't strange in these parts. Neighbors? Briggs's voice hardened. That woman's husband stole 10 head of my best cattle before he disappeared. Left me holding worthless promises to pay. The store fell silent. Lucas turned slowly, meeting Briggs's gaze. Thomas Harper's dead. His widow and children need shelter, nothing more. Dead or run off, makes no difference. Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice. That debt's still owing. Either she pays with the ranch she claims her husband left her, or I'll petition the court for custody of those children. Orphans need proper raising, after all. Lucas's hands tightened on the counter, but his voice remained steady. You're threatening a grieving mother with taking her children. Threatening? Briggs spread his hands in mock innocence. Just stating facts. Debts must be paid one way or another. Stay away from them, Briggs. Lucas's quiet words carried clearly in the hushed store. Those children are under my protection now. Briggs's smile never wavered. We'll see about that. He touched the brim of his hat. Good day, gentlemen. The bell chimed his exit, and conversation gradually resumed. Lucas paid for his supplies, nodding thanks to Peterson, who looked uncomfortable with the whole exchange. The drive home seemed longer, weight settling on Lucas's shoulders as he considered Briggs's threats. The man's reputation for getting his way, by any means necessary, was well known in the territory. At the ranch, Mrs. Harlow met him at the barn, her face tight with worry. Martha Jenkins rode out while you were gone, she said in low tones, as they unloaded supplies. Says there's talk in town about Clayton Briggs making claims on those children. Lucas set down a sack of flour with more force than necessary. Already spreading his poison. You've got to tell her, Lucas. Mrs. Harlow's voice was firm. Liza needs to know what she's facing. He knew the housekeeper was right, but the thought of bringing more fear into Liza's life sat heavy in his chest. Still, as evening approached and the children were settled with their supper, Lucas asked Liza to join him by the fire. Something happened in town today, he began, watching her face in the flickering light. Clayton Briggs made some claims about your husband. Liza's hands twisted in her lap. What kind of claims? Gently, Lucas explained about the cattle theft, accusations, and Briggs's demands. With each word, he saw Liza grow paler, her shoulders curling inward as if against a physical blow. He can't take my children, she whispered, but uncertainty threaded through her voice. He can't. No, he can't, Lucas assured her firmly. But you need to know what we're dealing with. Briggs has money and influence, and he's not above using either. Liza's hands trembled as she pressed them flat against her skirt. I thought we'd be safe here, she said softly. I thought finally. Her voice broke. You are safe, Lucas said, leaning forward to meet her eyes. I gave my word to protect you and the children, and I mean to keep it. But in the firelight, they both understood the fragility of their situation. Briggs's threats hung in the air. Between them, a shadow over the peace they'd barely begun to find. Morning light streamed through the kitchen windows as Lucas gathered tools from the barn. His mind churned with worry over Briggs's threats, but he refused to let fear shadow the children's day. Instead, he beckoned to young Eli, who hovered near the barn entrance. Want to learn something important? Lucas asked, retrieving a worn broom from its hook. Eli's eyes widened as he nodded, stepping closer. His small hands wrapped around the broom handle as Lucas showed him how to sweep in steady strokes. See here, Lucas demonstrated. You want to get all the hay neat, like make paths for the animals. He guided Eli's hands, remembering how he'd once taught his own son these same motions. The memory ached less now, softened by Eli's determined concentration. Meanwhile, Sarah skipped behind Mrs. Harlow toward the chicken coop, her dark braids bouncing. The old housekeeper showed her how to approach the nesting boxes quietly. Easy. Does it? Mrs. Harlow instructed. Reach under gentle like. Sarah's delighted laugh rang out as she discovered her first warm egg. Inside the house, Lisa sat by the window, afternoon light falling across her lap as she mended a pile of worn clothing. Her nimble fingers worked patches onto the children's clothes while Mrs. Harlow, returning from the coop, began teaching her to render fat for soap making. "We'll need good soap come spring," Mrs. Harlow explained, measuring lye carefully. "Proper washing keeps sickness at bay." Lisa absorbed every word, grateful for practical knowledge that would help her care for her children. "I never learned this before," she admitted softly. "We moved so often." Mrs. Harlow's weathered hand patted her shoulder. "Well, you're learning now, ain't you? That's what matters." As evening approached, Lucas lit the lamps and gathered everyone for supper. Steam rose from bowls of rich stew, and fresh bread waited to be broken. Without thinking, Lucas bowed his head. "Lord," he began, surprising himself with how naturally the words came, "we thank you for this food, for safety, and for," he paused, throat tight, "for filling this house with life again. Amen. Amen." The twins echoed enthusiastically, making. Lisa smiled despite her worried heart. Over their meal, Lucas found himself sharing tales of ranch life, funny stories about stubborn calves and clever horses. The children leaned forward, absorbed in every word. Sarah's eyes sparkled at mentions of wild mustangs, while Eli asked careful questions about caring for animals. "Did you really catch a whole herd by yourself?" Sarah asked, bouncing in her seat. Lucas chuckled, a sound that had grown rare before their arrival. "Well now, no man catches a herd alone. That's why we have good horses and better neighbors." After the dishes were cleared and the twins tucked into bed, Lisa lingered by the fireplace. The lantern cast a warm glow across her face as she watched. Lucas banked the flames. "I never thought I'd hear them laugh like that again," she confessed quietly. "After Thomas died, their eyes were so hollow. But today," she twisted her hands in her lap, "today I heard Sarah singing while she gathered eggs. And Eli, he was so proud of his sweeping." Lucas straightened, moved by the tremor in her voice. "Children are resilient," he said gently. "Give them safety and purpose. They bloom like prairie flowers after rain." "Safety," Lisa whispered, Briggs's threats clearly weighing on her mind. "I meant what I said," Lucas assured her firmly. "You're under my protection now, all of you." Looking around the lamplit room, Lucas felt the profound change in his home. Where silence had ruled for years, now children's boots stood by the door. Sarah's crude drawing of a horse hung proudly on the wall. Eli's carefully swept paths marked the barn floor. Even Mrs. Harlow hummed as she worked, something she hadn't done since his wife's passing. The house had transformed from a hollow reminder of loss into something warm and alive. Each small voice, each peal of laughter, each question asked in wonder, they all worked together, healing old wounds Lucas thought would never mend. Later that night, after the last lamp was extinguished, Lucas stood at his window. The moon cast silver light across the snow-covered yard, peaceful and still. From down the hall came the soft sound of Lisa singing a lullaby to the twins. The gentle melody drifted through the house like a blessing, turning the once empty rooms into a home again. Lucas closed his eyes, remembering his earlier prayer. Yes, the house was alive again, and so he realized was his heart. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, the winter sun casting long shadows across fresh snow. Lucas stood in the barn, carefully harnessing his team to the wagon. The brass buckles gleamed as he adjusted the leather straps, making sure everything sat just right for the journey into town. Inside the house, Lisa helped the twins into their freshly pressed clothes. Sarah twirled in her mended dress while Eli tugged at his collar, unused to Sunday best. Mrs. Harlow had worked miracles with needle and thread, turning threadbare garments into respectable church clothes. "Hold still now," Lisa murmured, smoothing Eli's cowlick with a damp hand. Her own heart fluttered with nervousness about facing the town, but she kept her voice steady for the children's sake. Lucas helped them all into the wagon, tucking warm blankets around their legs. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they set out, wagon wheels crunching through the packed snow. Sarah and Eli huddled close to their mother, watching their breath cloud in the winter air as they approached town. Church bells began to ring, their clear tones carrying across the pristine landscape. The sound stirred something in Lucas's chest. How long had it been since he'd attended services? The wooden church came into view, its white steeple reaching toward the pale blue sky. Lucas helped Lisa down from the wagon, then lifted each child carefully to the ground. Other wagons and riders were arriving, and the air filled with greetings and stamping boots. As they climbed the church steps, Lucas noticed the sudden hush that fell over the gathered townspeople. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Some faces lit with warm smiles. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, beamed at the twins. Others were pinched expressions of disapproval, eyeing Liza's presence beside the wealthy rancher with suspicion. "Welcome, welcome," Pastor Matthews called out, extending his hand. His genuine smile put Lisa at ease as he greeted each of them by name. "We're so pleased to have you join us today." Inside, the church glowed with morning light streaming through frosted windows. They settled into a pew, the twins between Lucas and Liza. The familiar scents of wood, polish and well-worn hymnals wrapped around them as more families filed in. The service began with a hymn Liza knew from childhood. Her voice joined the congregation softly at first, trembling like a new leaf in spring. The twins watched her face, then Lucas's, before adding their own clear voices to the singing. Pastor Matthews spoke of hope blooming in the depths of winter, of light penetrating the darkest seasons. His words seemed meant especially for them, though he never looked their way directly. Lucas found himself nodding, remembering how the light had returned to his own life through 3 unexpected guests. Throughout the service, the children stayed close to Lucas. Eli leaned against his arm while studying the Bible pictures, and Sarah slipped her small hand into his during prayers. These simple gestures didn't go unnoticed by the congregation. Every head that turned their way saw not just Lucas McCord, the stern rancher, but a man transformed by the presence of family. The changes in Lucas were obvious to those who knew him. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. His eyes, once clouded with grief, now held warmth as he helped Sarah find the right page in the hymnal. Even his posture had changed, no longer rigid with solitude, but gently curved toward the children at his side. Liza felt the weight of stares throughout the service. She caught fragments of whispered conversations, McCord family and those poor children, and Widow Harper. Her cheeks burned, but when Lucas steadied her elbow as they rose for another hymn, she lifted her chin. His quiet strength beside her made the gossip easier to bear. After the final amen, Pastor Matthews made a point of speaking with them again. "Your family brings joy to our congregation," he said, including all of them in his gentle smile. "I trust we'll see you next Sunday." Lucas nodded, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Yes, sir, weather permitting." As they made their way back to the wagon, townspeople clustered in small groups, their glances following the unlikely family. Lucas helped Lisa up to the seat with as much courtesy as any husband might show his wife. He settled the twins safely between them, tucking the blankets close against the cold. Liza's blush deepened as she overheard Mrs. Peterson say quite clearly, "Well, if that isn't the most natural thing in the world, Lucas McCord with a family." At last, Lucas felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest as he took up the reins. Pride, he realized, not in himself, but in these 3 beside him who had brought his home back to life. The whispers and stares hardly mattered compared to Sarah's delighted description of the church's stained glass, or Eli's serious questions about the sermon. The wagon pulled away from the church, bells tolling their farewell across the snow-covered town. They rode home together, their tracks leaving a single path through the fresh snow, while behind them the townsfolk's speculation grew like wind-blown flames about the family taking shape at the McCord Ranch. A week after the church service, hoofbeats thundered up the snow-packed drive to the McCord Ranch. Lucas stood at the kitchen window, watching Clayton Briggs's expensive black stallion kick up powder in the morning light. The rancher's fine wool coat and polished boots spoke of wealth, but his sharp-toothed smile revealed something darker. Lucas stepped onto the front porch, positioning himself between Briggs and the door. Behind him, he heard Lisa hushing the twins inside, away from windows. The winter air crackled with tension as Briggs dismounted, his spurs jangling against the wooden steps. "McCord," Briggs drawled, pulling off his leather gloves. "Providing shelter to thieves now, are you?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "State your business, Briggs." With theatrical slowness, Briggs reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. The document looked aged, its corners worn, but Lucas noticed the ink seemed too fresh, too dark against the yellowed page. "Got proof right here," Briggs announced, holding up the paper. A promissory note signed by James Harper, confessing to stealing 20 head of my prime cattle. Says right here he'd pay me back or forfeit his children's care to my ranch. Lucas's fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white with restraint. That's mighty convenient, finding such a note after James. Harper's been dead these 6 months. The kitchen door creaked open behind them. Lisa stood in the doorway, her face pale but chin lifted. "My husband never stole from anyone," she said, voice steady despite her trembling hands. "And he'd never bargain with our children's future." Briggs's smile widened as he turned toward her. A grieving widow's word against a respected rancher's legal document. "Think carefully about how this plays out, Mrs. Harper." Lucas took a step forward, his shadow falling across Briggs. "That paper's as false as your concern for those children." "Sheriff Doyle might see things differently," Briggs replied, tucking the note away. "Law's particular about debts and obligations out here. Shame if those twins had to be placed somewhere more suitable." "You wouldn't dare," Liza whispered, but fear had crept into her voice. Lucas moved closer to Lisa, his presence solid and reassuring. "Any man who'd forge papers to threaten children ain't fit to care for a cattle dog, let alone 2 innocent souls." Briggs's face darkened for a moment before his smirk returned. He adjusted his hat, studying them both with cold calculation. "I'll be back with the sheriff. Might want to pack those children's things. They'll be leaving with me next time." He turned on his heel, boots striking the porch boards with deliberate force. The black stallion wheeled sharply as Briggs mounted, showering the house with snow. His laughter drifted back as he rode away, carried on the winter wind like a coyote's howl. Liza's composure crumbled the moment Briggs disappeared down the drive. Her shoulders shook as she pressed her hands to her face. "What have I done?" she whispered. "My past, my husband's reputation. I've brought this darkness to your door." Lucas guided her gently inside, where Mrs. Harlow quickly shooed the twins upstairs with promises of stories. In the kitchen, lamplight cast warm circles on the scrubbed table as evening settled. Early outside the windows, tears rolled down Liza's cheeks as she sank into a chair. "Those children are all I have," she said, voice breaking. "They're innocent of their father's supposed crimes. How can Briggs be so cruel?" Lucas pulled his chair closer, his rough hand steady as he offered her a handkerchief. "Listen to me, Liza. We'll fight this with truth, not fear. That note's forged. Paper and ink can be examined, signatures compared." "But the sheriff," Lisa protested weakly. "Briggs has influence money, and we have something stronger," Lucas insisted. "We have right on our side, and folks in town who'll stand with us. Pastor Matthews, Mrs. Peterson, they've seen those children thrive here." Lisa wiped her eyes, trying to draw strength from his certainty. Still, worry lined her face as she glanced toward the stairs where her children slept. I never thought my past would haunt them like this. James wasn't perfect, but he loved those twins. He'd never have used them as collateral. The lamp flickered as wind rattled the windows. Lucas leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Your past ain't a chain, Liza. It's the path that led you here, to safety. And I aim to keep you safe. But unease hung heavy in the lamplit kitchen, thick as the shadows gathering in the corners. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake carrying the weight of tomorrow's confrontation. The twins' laughter drifted down from above, where Mrs. Harlow's stories had chased away their fears, if only adult worries could be so easily banished. 2 nights after Briggs's visit, lantern light pierced the darkness as 3 riders approached. The McCord Ranch. The cold winter air carried the jingle of spurs and the soft creak of leather as Sheriff Doyle and his deputies dismounted. Behind them, a wagon's wooden wheels crunched through frozen snow. Lucas stood on the porch, his frame rigid with tension. He had known this moment might come, but the sight of law enforcement arriving in darkness still sent ice through his veins. The sheriff's face was grim beneath his badge, avoiding Lucas's direct gaze. "Evening, McCord," Sheriff Doyle said, his voice carrying forced authority. "Got some papers here need attending to." "You know what you're doing ain't right, Amos," Lucas replied, using the sheriff's first name deliberately. "Those papers are forged, and you know it." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, fingering the documents Briggs had given him. "Law's the law, Lucas." Mr. Briggs presented legal documentation of his claim. "Can't ignore that." Inside, Liza had heard the commotion. She appeared in the doorway, her face draining of color as she saw the deputies moving toward the house. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No, please." The twins, awakened by voices, came padding down the stairs in their nightclothes. Sarah clutched her rag doll while Eli rubbed sleep from his eyes. "Mama?" Sarah called. Uncertain. The deputies brushed past Lucas, ignoring his warning glare. One reached for Eli while the other moved toward Sarah. The little girl screamed, dropping her doll as rough hands lifted her. "Don't touch them." Liza lunged forward, but Lucas caught her arms, knowing resistance would only make things worse. "Mama!" "Lucas!" The twins' cries pierced the night as the deputies carried them toward the waiting wagon. Sarah kicked and struggled. While Eli called out in confusion and fear, Liza collapsed against Lucas, her legs giving way as despair overwhelmed her. "Please," she begged the sheriff, "they're all I have. Don't take my babies." Lucas gripped her shoulders, supporting her weight as she swayed. His voice was fierce with conviction. "Listen to me, Liza. This ain't the end. I swear to you I will. Not rest until they're back home with us, you hear me? I won't stop." The twins' sobs grew fainter as the deputies placed them in the wagon. A blanket was thrown over their shivering forms, and the driver clucked to his horses. The wagon wheels began to turn, each creak a knife in Liza's heart. Sheriff Doyle mounted up, still avoiding their eyes. "They'll be well cared for at the Briggs Ranch," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. "You'll answer for this, Amos," Lucas said quietly, his tone carrying more weight than a shout. "Mark my words." The riders disappeared into the darkness, taking with them the lights, the sounds, and 2 precious souls who had brought life back to the ranch. In their wake, silence fell like a heavy shroud. Liza stumbled inside, Lucas supporting her every step. She made her way upstairs to the twins' room, where rumpled quilts still held the warmth of their small bodies. Sarah's doll lay forgotten on the floor where she had dropped it. Eli's wooden horse stood sentinel on the windowsill. A sob tore from Liza's throat as she sank onto one of the empty beds. She gathered Sarah's doll to her chest, rocking back and forth as waves of despair crashed over her. Lucas stood in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The old familiar rage he thought he had buried years ago boiled up inside him. His gun belt hung downstairs by the door. It would be so easy to ride out now, to answer this injustice with steel, and lead to make Briggs pay for his cruelty. But violence would not bring the children home. It would only destroy any chance of making things right. Still, the temptation burned in him like whiskey, demanding action, demanding revenge. Mrs. Harlow appeared beside him, her face lined with worry. She pressed a cup of tea into Liza's trembling hands, murmuring soft words of comfort that seemed to float away in the aching emptiness of the room. Outside, snow began to fall again, as if nature herself wept for the broken family. The ranch felt hollow now, every corner echoing with the absence of children's laughter. Lucas watched Liza's shoulders shake with silent sobs and felt something inside him harden into steel determination. There would be justice, but it would come through truth, not violence. He would find a way to expose Briggs's lies and bring the twins home, no matter the cost. The night stretched endless before them, filled with Liza's quiet weeping and the whisper of falling snow. 2 small beds stood empty, waiting for their occupants to return. On the windowsill, Eli's wooden horse faced east, toward the Briggs ranch, like a tiny sentinel keeping watch through the darkness. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold, but Lucas McCord took no joy in its beauty. He stood at his gun rack, checking the loaded chambers of his Winchester rifle with mechanical precision. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, though his mind churned with dark thoughts of vengeance. The soft crunch of hooves on snow drew his attention. Through the window, he spotted a familiar figure on horseback approaching the ranch house. Reverend Josiah Hale's old Mar picked her way carefully through the drifts, steam rising from her nostrils in the crisp morning air. Lucas set the rifle aside as Mrs. Harlow opened the door to welcome the preacher. The elderly man's face was etched with concern as he stomped snow from his boots. "I heard about the children," Reverend Hawley said softly, removing his worn hat. "Word travels fast, even in winter." Mrs. Harlow was already pouring coffee into tin cups, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. Liza emerged from upstairs, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. She nodded silently to the preacher before sinking into a chair at the rough-hewn table. The Reverend wrapped his weathered hands around the steaming cup. "I saw you checking your rifle, Lucas," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I reckon I know what's in your heart right now." Lucas's jaw tightened. Briggs needs to answer for what he's done. "Indeed he does," Reverend Hawley agreed. "But justice isn't won with bullets, son. It's won with truth and mercy." "Mercy?" Lucas's voice cracked like a whip. Where was mercy when they tore those children from their beds? The preacher met his gaze steadily. "The Lord's mercy isn't just for those who deserve it. Sometimes it's the tool he uses to bring truth to light." Liza's hands trembled around her coffee cup. "I keep praying," she whispered, "but I feel so helpless." "Prayer ain't being helpless," Reverend Halla said. "It's calling on the strongest ally we have." He turned back to Lucas. "Violence might feel right, but it won't bring those children home. It'll just give Briggs more power to keep them away." Lucas paced the kitchen, conflict evident in every step. The rifle seemed to call to him from where it leaned against the wall. But the preacher's words rang true, cutting through his anger like sunrise through morning fog. Finally, he stopped. With deliberate movements, he lifted the Winchester and returned it to its rack. "Then how do we fight this?" he asked with truth. Reverend Hawley replied, "Every lie leaves tracks, just like footprints in snow. We follow those tracks back to their source." Liza straightened in her chair, a spark of hope lighting in her eyes. "Briggs's note, the one claiming my husband stole cattle. There must be a way to prove it's false." Lucas nodded slowly, his mind shifting from thoughts of revenge to strategy. "Old Joe Turner," he said. "He worked Briggs's ranch for 15 years before retiring last spring. If anyone knows about stolen cattle or forged documents, it'd be him. The Lord often places witnesses in unexpected places, Reverend Hawley agreed. But remember, we're seeking justice, not revenge. The truth must be brought to light in a way that even Briggs's friends in town can't ignore. They spent the afternoon planning, while Mrs. Harlow kept the coffee flowing and added wood to the fire. As evening approached, Lucas prepared to ride into town. The temperature was dropping, promising another cold night. Liza caught his arm as he donned his heavy coat. "Be careful," she said softly. "We can't help the twins if anything happens to you." Lucas covered her hand with his own. "I promise I'm not looking for trouble, just truth." Reverend Hawley offered a prayer before Lucas mounted up, asking for guidance and protection. The words settled over them like a warm blanket, strengthening their resolve. As Lucas rode out, the setting sun cast long shadows across the snow. His anger still burned, but it had been transformed into something more focused, more purposeful. The preacher's words echoed in his mind, justice through truth, not violence. The lights of town began to appear in the distance, tiny flames against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in those streets, old Joe Turner would be settling in for the evening. Lucas hoped the old ranch hand's memory and conscience would be clear enough to help expose Briggs's deception. Behind him, at the ranch house, Liza and Reverend Hawley knelt in prayer. Their faith, though tested, remained unbroken. In the children's room upstairs, 2 empty beds waited in silence, their small occupants sorely missed but not forgotten. The evening wind carried whispers of change across the Colorado highlands. Justice would come, not in the bark of a rifle, but in the steady revelation of truth. Guided by mercy and faith, Lucas tied his horse outside the Dusty Spur Saloon, where old Joe Turner spent most evenings nursing warm beer and sharing tales of his ranching days. The wooden sidewalk creaked beneath his boots as he pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon's warmth hit him like a wall after the bitter cold outside. Tobacco smoke hung thick near the ceiling, and a tired piano player picked out a quiet tune in the corner. Several heads turned at his entrance, but Lucas paid them no mind. His eyes fixed on the stooped figure at the end of the bar. Joe Turner, hunched over his beer mug, his weathered face lined with years of sun and wind. His hands, gnarled from decades of ranch work, trembled slightly as he lifted the mug to his lips. "Evening, Joe," Lucas said quietly, settling onto the neighboring stool. "Mind if we talk?" The old ranch hand's roomy eyes studied Lucas warily. "Figured you'd come looking after what happened with them kids." Lucas ordered 2 fresh beers, waiting until the bartender moved away before speaking again. "You worked Briggs's spread for 15 years. I reckon you saw things." Joe's shoulders tensed. "Lots of things happen on a ranch over 15 years. I'm talking about stolen cattle," Lucas pressed, keeping his voice low. "And a man wrongly blamed." The old-timer's hands tightened around his mug. "Ain't my business anymore. I'm retired now." "Those children were torn from their mother tonight," Lucas said, an edge creeping into his voice. "A dead man's name stays stained. That makes it everyone's business." Joe took a long drink, then set his mug down with deliberate care. "Briggs, he ain't what folks think. Man's got a silver tongue but a heart black as pitch. Tell me about the cattle theft." The old ranch hand glanced around nervously before leaning closer. It was 3 years back. Briggs was hurting for cash after a bad winter. Started talking about easy money, how some smaller spreads wouldn't notice a few head missing here and there. Lucas listened intently as Joe's story spilled out. Briggs had orchestrated the whole thing, sending hands to rustle cattle from neighboring ranches under cover of darkness. When suspicions arose, he'd planted evidence pointing to Liza's husband and others. "But you got proof?" Lucas asked. Joe nodded slowly. "Briggs kept records of everything. Thought he was too clever to get caught. Made me keep a separate ledger, showing where them stolen cattle really came from and when they were rebranded. Where's this ledger now? In my room. At the boarding house. Kept it as insurance, case Briggs ever turned on me. Joe's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Man's got a mean streak when crossed. They finished their beers in silence, then walked through the cold night to Joe's boarding house. The old ranch hand's room was spare and neat, with a narrow bed and a battered trunk. Joe pulled a leather-bound book from beneath his mattress, handling it like it might explode. Lucas opened the ledger carefully. Page after page detailed cattle movements, brands changed, dates that matched perfectly with the alleged thefts. Most importantly, it showed clearly that the cattle Liza's husband had been accused of stealing had actually been taken by Briggs's men. This is his writing? Lucas asked, pointing to annotations in the margins. Every scratch, Joe confirmed. Man always did love keeping notes on his schemes. Lucas tucked the ledger securely inside his coat. You're a brave man, Joe Turner. The old-timer shook his head. Just tired of carrying the weight of it. Them kids deserve better than living under Briggs's thumb. Back at the ranch, Liza paced the floor of the children's room, her shadow dancing in the lamplight. Her fingers traced the empty beds where Sarah and Eli should have been sleeping. The quiet felt wrong. No soft breathing, no rustling of blankets. No whispered conversations between twins who should have been asleep. Lord, she prayed softly, keep them safe tonight. Let them feel my love across the miles. And please help Lucas find a way to bring them home. The crunch of hooves in snow made her heart leap. She hurried downstairs just as Lucas stamped snow from his boots in the entryway. His face was red from cold, but his eyes held a fierce light. I found it, he said without preamble, pulling the ledger from his coat. Proof that Briggs was behind everything. They sat at the kitchen table while Lucas explained what Joe Turner had revealed. Liza's hands shook as she turned the pages, reading the damning evidence of Briggs's crimes. This will clear my husband's name, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But will it be enough? Briggs has friends in town, influence with the sheriff. Truth has power of its own, Lucas said firmly, though concern flickered across his face. Come morning, we'll take this to Judge Wilson. He's always been fair, even with men like Briggs. Liza nodded, but fear still haunted her eyes. They both knew Briggs wouldn't give up easily, even with proof of his crimes. The ledger was a weapon, but wielding it against such a powerful man would take courage and faith. The lamp burned low as they studied the ledger's pages, preparing for the battle ahead. Outside, snow began falling again, covering their tracks in fresh white powder. In town, their children slept under Briggs's roof, while hope and justice waited for the dawn. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the fresh snow gleaming like diamonds under the winter sun. Lucas guided the wagon carefully along the rutted road toward town, the precious ledger tucked securely inside his coat. Beside him, Liza sat rigid with tension, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. The leather-bound book felt heavy against Lucas's chest, heavy with truth, heavy with hope. The little white church stood proudly against the blue sky, its fresh coat of paint bright in the morning light. Wagon wheels crunched through snow as families arrived for service, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Children's laughter rang out across the churchyard, making Liza's heart ache for Sarah and Eli. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over the wooden pews. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and pine boughs decorated for Christmas filled the air. Lucas and Liza slipped into a pew near the back, nodding quietly to their neighbors. Across the aisle, several townsfolk whispered behind raised hands, their eyes darting between Lucas and the empty spaces where the twins should have been. Clayton Briggs sat in his usual place of prominence near the front, his head held high. The sheriff occupied the pew behind him, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best. Neither man glanced back as Reverend Holly stepped to the pulpit, though Lucas noticed the sheriff's shoulders tense when the preacher began speaking about truth and justice. "Let us lift our voices in praise," Reverend Hawley announced, and the congregation rose. The old pump organ wheezed to life as familiar hymn notes filled the sanctuary. Lucas felt Lisa trembling beside him as they sang, her voice barely a whisper. When the final notes faded, before anyone could sit, Lucas stepped into the aisle. His movement drew all eyes, and the rustle of skirts and shuffling of boots fell silent. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," Lucas said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "But there's a matter of truth that needs speaking. In God's house." Reverend Hawley studied him thoughtfully, then nodded. "Truth is always welcome here, Brother McCord." Lucas withdrew the ledger from his coat, holding it up for all to see. "This book holds proof of grave wrongs done to innocent people. Proof that Clayton Briggs stole cattle and blamed others to hide his crimes." Briggs shot to his feet, his face flushing dark red. "How dare you spread lies in church? Sheriff, arrest this man for slander." "Silence!" Reverend Hale's commanding tone cut through the growing murmurs. "Let him speak." Lucas opened the ledger, his steady hands turning to marked pages. "This is Briggs's own writing, documenting every stolen head of cattle, every false brand, every man he blamed to cover his tracks." He looked directly at the sheriff, including Liza Harper's husband. The sheriff stood slowly, his weathered face troubled. "Those are serious accusations, McCord. See for yourself." Lucas held out the ledger. "Compare the writing to any document Briggs has signed. The truth is there in black and white." The sheriff took the book, studying the neat columns of figures and dates. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he turned page after page. "This is definitely Briggs's hand. I've seen it enough on legal papers to know." Briggs lunged forward, trying to snatch the ledger. "It's forgery. These are lies." "No more lies, Clayton," a gravelly voice called out. Old Joe Turner stood up from his place near the back. "I kept that ledger on your orders. Every word in it is true, and you know it." A wave of whispers swept through the congregation. Mothers pulled children closer, men shook their heads in disgust. The sheriff's face hardened as he realized how thoroughly he'd been deceived. "Clayton Briggs," he said formally, "you're under arrest for cattle theft and fraud. Those children will be returned to their mother immediately. You can't do this to me." Briggs shouted, his carefully maintained facade crumbling. "I own half this town." "Not anymore," the sheriff replied grimly. Briggs stormed down the aisle, shoving past Lucas. The heavy door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the stunned silence. Liza sat trembling, tears streaming down her face as neighbors gathered around her, offering comfort and apologies for believing the lies. Lucas stood steady beside her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "The twins will be home today," he said softly. "Where they belong." Reverend Hawley raised his hands for quiet. "Let us pray," he intoned, "for justice restored, for truth revealed, and for a family soon to be reunited." The congregation bowed their heads, but Liza kept her eyes open, fixed on the sunlight streaming through the church windows. For the first time since the children were taken, hope blazed bright and clear in her heart. The winter sun had just begun to set when hoofbeats echoed across the snowy yard. Lucas stood at the window, his heart quickening as he spotted the sheriff's wagon approaching through the gathering dusk. Beside him, Liza pressed her hands to her mouth, barely daring to breathe. The wagon hadn't fully stopped before Sarah and Eli tumbled out, their boots crunching in the fresh snow as they ran toward the house. Liza flung open the door, dropping to her knees as her children crashed into her arms. Their joyful cries filled the cold evening air. "Mama! Mama!" Sarah buried her face in her mother's neck while Eli wrapped his small arms around both of them. The twins spotted Lucas standing in the doorway and broke free to hug his legs. He knelt down, gathering them close as Sheriff Doyle approached, hat in hand. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper," the sheriff said gruffly, his weathered face etched with regret. "I should have looked harder at those papers before acting on them." Lucas stood, keeping one hand on each child's shoulder. What matters is their home now. Lisa wiped tears from her cheeks as she rose. Thank you for bringing them back. The delicious smell of Mrs. Harlow's cooking wafted from the kitchen, where she was preparing a special homecoming supper. The old housekeeper hummed hymns as she worked, her own eyes bright with happiness. Lucas cleared his throat, looking directly at Lisa. This house is yours as long as you want it, he said softly but firmly. All of you. The hearth fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow began falling again, not the harsh, driving flakes of that first desperate night, but gentle crystals that settled like a blessing on the land. For the first time since Lucas could remember, the ranch house rang with children's laughter, whispered prayers of gratitude, and the unmistakable sound of family. Days melted into a gentle rhythm at the McCord Ranch. Morning sun found Eli trailing behind Lucas, his small hands gripping fence posts while they worked together. The boy's face glowed with pride as Lucas showed him how to check for loose wires in the chicken coop. Sarah's giggles mixed with Mrs. Harlow's patient instructions. Careful now, child, she'd say, as Sarah reached beneath warm feathers for fresh eggs. The girl's basket grew fuller each day, matching her confidence. Inside the warm kitchen, Liza's hands worked bread dough with sure strokes. The familiar task brought peace to her heart, knowing her children were safe and loved. That evening, after the day's work was done, Lucas found Liza alone by the hearth. Stay, he said softly. Not because you need to, but because we've become family. Tears sparkled in Liza's eyes as she whispered, Thank the Lord. At supper, the twins' laughter rang out when Eli knocked over his milk. Rather than scold, Lucas smiled, watching the family he'd found. Through the windows, lamplight spilled across fresh snow, marking their home with golden warmth. His promise, made that desperate night, was finally complete. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.